Hi, I'm Tiffany and I'm here at Tacomoto. If you went to Babes in the Dirt 6, you surely remember them and all they did to help keep the girls' bikes running. If you're coming to Babe 7, you're in luck because they're coming back and you're going to get to meet them. We decided to get together and do a video series to help women prepare for the event and also riding in general. So for our first video, we're going to go over things that you can and should do to ensure your bike is safe and ready to ride. Consider it a pre-ride checklist, or for the ladies, consider it no different than your monthly self-exam. The more you put your hands on your bike and familiarize yourself with it, the more likely you are to identify problems and be able to address them. And just like that exam, it's always good to start with a shower. There are a lot of awesome videos out there on how to wash a bike. We'll drop a link below. But for this, we just want to highlight where it's most important to not pressure wash your bike, namely your seals, bearings, electrical components, and your exhaust. Before you wash your bike, a little cheat tip. You might want to look and check and see if you have any leaks. Look down your forks and see if you have a fork seal leak, anything on the engine. Check both your clutch and brake master cylinder, radiators, your rear brake line and bleeder, your counter shaft seal, your clutch, your gas, again, your other radiators, just to be aware of what's going on with your bike before you wash away the evidence. All right, so now that you're starting with a clean bike and you've inspected it for any leaks, let's start with our checklist on what to inspect before you ride, starting with our tires. First thing you want to look at is your tread and tread depth. Also look for any signs of damage, dry rot, cracking on the rubber. Important to note, tires will have an indicator sometimes for the rotation that make sure they're mounted properly. Another thing to look for, if you're not aware, there are different types of systems for tires. On a tube tire, which is standard from the factory, you'll have one valve stem and one rim lock. On a tubeless system, you will have two valve stems. One will typically be red, that is the tubeless inner tube, which serves as one giant rim lock, and the second to fill the air within the wheel or the tire itself. And finally, on a moose or bib system, you'll have one or two rim locks, no valve stems. So we mentioned rim lock earlier. It's another item you want to check on your tires. If you have them installed, there is obviously the valve stem for the air, and then the rim lock is fatter. It's usually a 10 mil wrench, and you just want to do righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Snug that guy down. You don't have to go gorilla on it, but you definitely want it snug. It's also important to check your spokes. They're what keep your wheel round and true. One way to do this is the sound method. Simply rotate your wheel and tap your spokes and see if any sound different. If they do, they're likely tight or loose and need adjustment. We will include a link on how to do this or make a video later. Another thing to check is your wheel bearings. And an easy way to do that, especially while you're on a stand, is just hold the bike steady and see if there's any play, left and right, back and forth. Give it a really good push. There should be no movement laterally, and the wheel should spin just fine, no wobbles. And you want to do the same thing on your front tire. You want to check your bearings, see if there's any wobble, ensure that it spins freely, there's no drag. Lastly, yours may look a little different, but it's important to also ensure that your axles are both lubricated and appropriately torqued down on both the rear and your front wheels. Visually inspect your brake pads to make sure that they are thick and not cracked. For your rotors, you want to look and make sure they're not bent or gouged and that your wheel rotates smoothly and doesn't wobble when turned. And simply repeat the same process on the front tire. If you have a drum brake versus a disc brake, you'll also want to check that it's appropriately adjusted. Look at your rear brake lever. You want to ensure that your spring is present, that the bolts are tight, and that it functions freely. And last step of your brake inspection, look at your rear master cylinder. There's a window typically for your fluid level and also the color. Take a look at your lines, make sure there are no leaks, trace it back. Look for the banjo valve, the bleeder valve, and same with the front brake master cylinder. Ensure that there's no leaks, the bolts are in place, the window level indicator is full, and trace your lines, your brake line, down to the brakes. Again, ensuring that your banjo bolt, your bleeder, and no other components are leaking. Moving on to suspension. For your front forks, the first thing you want to check is that there is no leaking fork oil. your dust seals are in place and not damaged. Check your rear suspension, your rear spring. You want to look, as we noted before, for any signs of a leaky seal or oil. Depending on your type of fork, you may have a small screw or an aftermarket bleeder valve. Press this or release the screw to release the air from your forks. Fork oil does break down with use and needs to be replaced, so check your manufacturer's recommendations on the appropriate weight and interval for your bike. We can't cover it in this simple bike prep checklist video, but setting your sag is an important part of bike setup. It is done by adjusting your rear spring preload based on rider weight. During your inspection, double check your shock collar position and ensure that your locking collar is in place and tight. These can sometimes loosen with riding. Not too much unlike checking the bearings on your wheels. If your bike is on a stand, and especially if it's firmly affixed like mine is, you can push side to side on your swing arms and see if there's any laxity, any side to side motion. There should not be. You can also place a finger or two between the frame and your swing arm and also try to push and see if you can feel any motion. On mine, there's none. Also, critically important but often overlooked, you should inspect and lubricate the bearings on your swing arm and linkage if that's the type of system you have. Consult your service manual for the appropriate grease and service interval, but if you can't find it, we recommend using a waterproof grease and doing this at least once per year, more if you ride a lot. With your bike on a stand, one way to check your rear linkage is to lift the rear tire. I'm going to do that with my knee and then closely inspect if there's any movement in the joints or the bearings themselves. I don't know if you can see it, very, very slight motion at the main bearing here. I don't think it's a concern yet, but I'm going to keep an eye on it. Use a torque wrench. We'll show you how to use that later, and make sure that you are to spec on all of your triple clamp bolts. Torque specs are very important here because you can crush your forks or affect how they travel. Look that up in your specific manual. Check your torque specs and ensure that your bolts are tight, holding the rear shock in place. While we're down here, let's do a quick visual inspection of our exhaust. Unless you're a pro rider or have a brand new bike, it's unlikely you will have a perfect pipe. Some denting is to be expected and okay. What you're looking for is any holes in the metal or bent too much around the frame that can cause vibration. But big dents like this, usually not too much of a problem unless the pipe itself is completely collapsed or perforated. Depending on where you ride, you may be required to have a silencer or a spark arrestor. Ensure those are in place. Check your head pipe attachments, namely the spring clamps and bolts. Also the joint or gasket seal. You may or may not have this style with a spring. You might have hose clamps as well. To the silencer, which is usually just a slip tip and held on with 2 bolts. This has a grab bar. Not all bikes will have this. It may just be 2 bolts again. Just make sure that they're tight and present. All right, now we'll move to our driveline inspection. It's really important to look at your countershaft seal again. If there are any leaks, you want to check that out, see where that's coming from. Also check the wear on your sprocket front and rear. You don't want any missing teeth, bent teeth, excessively skinny teeth. Same thing with chain wear. Just visually inspect it. Make sure there are no weird kinks or bends, not excessive rust or dirt. Really important, you want to check your chain tension. Typically you want about 2 fingers over the chain guide, or you can buy the fancy TacoMoto chain tensioning inspection tool. Slide this guy in, and once it's in place, you should have just enough room to wiggle a couple of the links, but not completely bend it, to ensure that your chain is appropriately tensioned. Hopefully you did this after washing your bike, but also ensure that your chain is clean and appropriately lubricated. Your chassis is the frame of your bike and effectively its skeleton. Everything attaches to it. With the vibration of riding, bolts can wiggle loose, so check every attachment point to your frame, including your subframe, and if the plastics are removed, your swing arm, any bolt that you can see. Check your torque specs and make sure it's present and tight. Be careful not to strip these bolts. If you're doing your chassis check, go ahead and check your skid plate. Make sure that it is bolted on tightly. Your foot pegs, ensure that they're not damaged and also attached, as well as your kickstand, that it has its retractor spring and the bolt is tight. Moving on to the engine, the heart of your machine, you'll want to check the oil level and quality. If you have a viewport such as this one, it makes it easy. If there's no viewport, you may have a bolt, such as the KTM model, where you can release that and the oil should just dribble or pour out. If you don't see oil, fill it until you do. Or you may have something similar to your vehicle with a small dipstick and fluid level indicator. You should change your motor oil according to your manufacturer's recommendations, but you can also visually inspect the quality of the oil, especially if you have the dipstick style or the viewport. It's very easy to see how dark it is. If it's excessively dark, you should consider changing it, along with your oil filters if your bike has them. When you do check your oil, take a look at the oil cap and make sure that the rubber gasket is in good shape. Also, on your drain bolt, there should be a crush washer. Make sure that's in good shape and that the bolt is tight. You should also inspect your engine cases for any cracks or signs of damage, as well as tighten all the bolts. Do this on both sides and be sure to check your manual for the torque settings. While you're down here, also inspect your shift lever. Make sure that it's not bent, rubbing your case, cracked, or broken, and also ensure that it's tightly affixed by checking the bolt. Moving on to the fuel system, we'll start with a visual inspection, starting with the caps. This bike is a TPI bike, so it also has an oil filler port. I want to ensure that both caps are present and there's no cracks around the neck of the filler port, and that the gas cap has an overflow hose. Also, moving down the tank itself and looking for any visual signs of wear, any damage. It's also important to check the integrity of your petcock and the fuel ports. If your bike has a petcock, you'll also want to ensure that it is functional and not leaking. And of course, you'll want to check your hoses and clamps. On a fuel injected bike or this type of bike, there is a push release, and on the inside of your hose there is a small inline fuel filter, something to be aware of for your maintenance. Also inside the tank itself there is another fuel filter internal in the tank, and you should change that whenever you suspect you've gotten dirty gas or dirt in there, or per your manufacturer's recommendations. Cleaning and adjusting a carburetor is beyond the scope of this checklist, but things you'll want to look for are your boot seals to ensure that they're appropriately attached. Note that this one is not. Your bike may differ, but you'll also want to make sure that your choke and idle are functioning when the bike is running. Moving on to your radiators. Do a quick visual inspection of the exterior. This has an aftermarket brace on it, but what you're looking for are cracks, major dents, dings, of course leaks. If your louvers are too smashed, that won't allow appropriate airflow. Check out your left and right. Also be sure to check all your hoses and clamps, both top and bottom, as well as the bolts and attachments to your bike. With the bike cold and level, remove your cap and check the fluid. It should be to the top of the fins. You'll also want to take a second to look at the cap itself and ensure that the gaskets are in good condition and present and not torn. And be sure to replace your cap tightly. If installed, also check your radiator fan. This is an aftermarket fan with a digital thermostat and the temperature probe inserted here. Some models also come with a stock thermostat. Bars and controls. This is the view you're probably most familiar with on your bike, but we'll show you a few things to check out, starting with your bars themselves. Do a quick visual inspection of your bars to ensure they're not bent from a crash. Also, they should gently sweep back towards you, but that is a note of personal preference. Your bars are attached at the center point by brackets and bolts. Ensure that these are tight. You can also loosen them and rotate the bars if you wish. You'll want to inspect your front brake and your clutch lever to ensure that they're intact and functioning and also at a position you like. Same with any of the other controls on your bike. These are very easy to move, typically just with some bolts. Depending on your model and the accessories installed, your components may look different. For instance, high-low beams, blinkers, horn, rear view mirrors, attachments for GPS and other devices, kill switch, and starter button. Also, while we're inspecting our bars, it's really important to ensure that you have good throttle response. You want to ensure that you have a little bit of free play before it engages, and then also good snap back. These two bolts here are what holds on your throttle body. Ensure that those are tight. I like to leave mine just a little bit loose. This one says 5 Newton meters, so it's not over tightened. That allows it to move in the event of a crash instead of just break. But your throttle cables are under your rubber gasket here. And you can adjust your tightment, your snap and response here. If it's still sticky, you're probably going to have to take this whole thing off and clean it out. That's a separate video. Also inspect your hand grips. Bike may have flags or a set of full hand wraps for your hand protection. Either way, ensure that the bolts are tight and also that the position is correct so that it protects your hands and your levers in a crash. The next items on our checklist, we're going to want to remove the seat so we can get inside the bike and scope out our battery. On this bike, it's a simple 8mm socket to a bolt. This one's been pre-loosened. All you do is pull that long bolt, lift the seat, and pull it back over the tabs. And then seat removal is easiest. The batteries typically last 4 to 6 years. If your bike is dead and won't start, that's a good place to begin looking. You want to ensure that your terminal connections are tight, and also if there's a ground that it's also tightly screwed in. You want to check that there's no corrosion, and also check the attachments for any of your aftermarket components. If one of your electrical components is not working and you know your battery is in good condition, you may also want to check your fuses. Many bikes will have a small fuse box somewhere located close to the battery. If it's an aftermarket component, it may have its own inline fuse. Look for something like this. If that doesn't solve it, check the connections themselves. Sometimes they can become corroded and all you have to do is clean them or add a little dielectric grease. And if that doesn't fix it, you may need to chase the wires and look for any damage or broken joints or connections. All right, right now we're going to change the air filter. It's probably one of the most critical things for you to routinely check on your bike. I mean, the whole checklist is important. This one, do not skip. So it might be intimidating to remove your plastics. There are usually simple pop tabs. Yours might be different, but on this one, don't be afraid to yank it. And for the KTMs, there's also a little tab. Remove the airbox cover, and then you'll see what you're working with. So for my bike, it's a plastic tab on the bottom of the air filter bracket. You'll pull it out. There's a second one on top. I don't know if you can get in and see that, but there's a simple receiver. And then once you get your air filter off, I also like to inspect inside of the air box. I'm pretty happy to see that there's no dirt inside of my bike in the air box, so that filter did its job. This is what it should look like. This is what it shouldn't look like. So just a note of caution, anytime you have your air filter off your bike, your engine is basically exposed to the elements. If you're in the dust and wind, immediately take a clean rag and stuff it down in the airbox. Also keeps tools and other parts from falling in there, any dirt, anything you don't want in your engine, keep it out. Once your air filter is out, do a visual inspection, ensure you don't have any major holes, tears, any obvious problems, and yours might be slightly shaped differently, but most of them have the same design. You just pull the filter over the plastic frame. There may be some tabs, release those carefully, and then remove the filter frame from the filter itself for cleaning. Once you have your fresh filter oiled and you're happy with the distribution, go ahead and work backwards. Put your filter back on the cage. So now that I have my filter back on the cage and ready to reinstall, I'm going to do something different. Typically I put rim grease or some sort of grease around the edge of the airbox to help get an even better seal so you don't have any dirt blow by. But this time we're going to go with a PC Racing Pro Seal. It's an air filter gasket. Remove the towel. Do not leave this in your bike. And reinstall your filter. Pop that in. Push the filter down. Same thing on the bottom. And your filter's reinstalled. All you have to do is reinstall your cover. When you're putting your plastics back on, there are these little push tabs, and you're not going to hurt it, but you do want to hear it pop, or feel it slide in at least. You're done. Next up, replace the seat. For mine, there are 2 attachment points on the tank that go into 2 receiving slots on the plastic base of the seat. So when I install it, I'm going to make sure I start behind those, push down, slide forward, make sure you grab those tabs, and then line up your bolt. Your seat may be different. Hopefully you'll remember it when you take it off. Pay attention to that, and you should be good. Before you consider yourself done with your work, it's never a bad idea to go around every portion of the bike, checking your plastics, all of your bolts, tightening them down, looking for signs of wear or damage, and taking note of anything that stands out. This is also a great time to add Tacomoto stickers. And that concludes our basic overview of pre-ride preparation. Team Taco hopes you enjoyed the video. Unfortunately, we can't cover all makes and models of bikes, so if we did say or show something that doesn't make sense, feel free to send us a note or leave a comment. Also, please, please, please refer to your bike service manual for torque specs and specifics, or phone a friend who also happens to be a professional mechanic. Finally, we did say at the start, we want to make this a series. This is the first video, and if there's something you're burning to learn, drop it in the comments and we'll do our best to cover it. I like to leave mine a little loose. In the event of a crash, they're allowed to spin instead of break. Outtakes. Continue with our check next. Check next. Check next. Let's see how you do a basic exam. Make sure you get the armpits. Oh yeah. She's a little lumpy. If there's something you're burning to learn, feel free to drop it in the comments and we'll do our best to make it. I fucked it at the end!